When Hollywood icon Morgan Freeman steps onto a live talk show, he expects a thoughtful and respectful discussion. But the host takes a different approach, firing off intrusive and inappropriate questions. Rather than losing his composure, Freeman responds in a way that leaves the entire audience in awe. His calm yet commanding words shift the atmosphere entirely, rendering everyone speechless. This unforgettable moment is yet another reason why Morgan Freeman remains one of the most revered figures in Hollywood. The air in the studio was thick with anticipation. Every seat was taken. Millions of viewers tuned in from their homes, eager to hear the wisdom of Morgan Freeman, the man whose voice had narrated the essence of life itself. At 86, he was as sharp, poised, and respected as ever. He walked onto the stage slowly, his deep, familiar voice greeting the audience. The crowd erupted in applause, some even wiping away tears. But as he settled into his chair, something felt off. The host, Vanessa Clark, was known for her bold, often ruthless approach. Morgan had done countless interviews, but tonight would be unlike any other. She leaned forward, a smirk playing on her lips. "So, Morgan," she began, her voice smooth, yet cutting. "At your age, do you ever wake up wondering if today might be your last?" The room fell into silence. Smiles vanished. Morgan didn't flinch. He simply folded his hands in his lap and met her gaze. A storm was brewing, and Vanessa had no clue what she had just set in motion. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others shifted in their seats. Vanessa let out a chuckle, as if her words were harmless. Morgan Freeman remained motionless. His eyes, deep, wise, and knowing, rested on her. But Vanessa wasn't finished. "You've played God," she pressed, tilting her head. "But let's be real. You're just a man, a very old man. What's it like knowing your time is almost up?" Gasps echoed through the studio. An elderly woman in the front row placed a hand over her heart. Morgan exhaled quietly, shaking his head. He had spent decades in Hollywood. He had witnessed arrogance, cruelty, and blatant disrespect. But this was something else. Vanessa was reveling in it. The camera zoomed in on Morgan's face. His expression was impossible to read, but inside, he was thinking, remembering. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every elderly person watching, every individual who had been overlooked, dismissed, made to feel like they no longer mattered. And so, when he finally spoke, the world listened. Morgan leaned in, his hands clasped together. "Miss Clark," he said, his voice calm but cutting, "have you ever sat beside someone as they took their final breath?" The question sent a chill through the room. Vanessa blinked. She hadn't seen that coming. "Well, she faltered. But Morgan didn't let her finish. "I have," he said quietly. "Many times." The room fell into a heavy silence. His voice carried the weight of countless memories. "I have held the hands of dear friends as they spoke their last words," he continued. "I have watched remarkable men and women take their final breaths. And do you know what they regret the most?" Vanessa swallowed hard. "They never long for more money or more fame. They wish they had loved more, forgiven more, cherished life more." The camera panned to the audience. Some had tears in their eyes. Morgan met Vanessa's gaze, looking deep into her soul. "You ask me what it feels like to be old," he said. "It feels like a privilege denied to many." The audience erupted. Some stood clapping through their tears. But Morgan wasn't finished. And Vanessa, for the first time in her career, was speechless. Vanessa Clark sat frozen, gripping her cue cards as if they were the only thing anchoring her. The studio was silent. The audience barely breathed. Morgan Freeman's words lingered in the air, undeniable and unforgettable. It felt like an honor that many never get to experience. Amid the crowd, a woman quietly wiped away her tears. Nearby, an elderly man, likely in his 70s, clenched his fists, lost in a memory of someone he once loved. Vanessa let out a laugh, but it trembled as it left her lips. "Well, Morgan, you sure know how to spin a tale. But let's be honest." She hesitated, then pressed on. "People your age, Hollywood tends to forget about them, doesn't it?" A collective gasp spread through the audience. Morgan exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. He rubbed his fingers together, a familiar gesture when he was deep in thought. His gaze settled on Vanessa, not with anger, not with offense, but with something softer, pity. Then he spoke. "My dear, let me tell you a story." The audience leaned forward. Morgan Freeman was about to speak, and when Morgan Freeman speaks, you listen. "There was once a young man," he began, his voice rich with emotion. "He was full of dreams, full of life, pity." Then he spoke. "My dear, let me tell you a story." The audience leaned forward. Morgan Freeman was about to speak, and when Morgan Freeman speaks, you listen. "There was once a young man," he began, his voice rich with emotion. "He was full of dreams, full of life. He believed the world would always have a place for him. But time has a way of humbling us." The room fell silent. One day, that young man grew old, and he realized that the same world that once applauded him had moved on. They no longer saw him. They no longer listened. A woman in the crowd covered her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. "But one night," Morgan continued, "he sat by his window and watched a storm roll in. And that's when it hit him." Vanessa swallowed, her confidence wavering. He realized that even when the sky turns dark, even when the world seems to have forgotten the sun is still there, still burning, still shining, even behind the clouds. A quiet sniffle broke the silence, then another. Morgan's eyes softened as he looked at Vanessa. "So, my dear," he said gently, "irrelevance is a label the world gives to those who have lived long enough to gain wisdom. But wisdom never fades." Vanessa's lips parted slightly, as if searching for words, but for the first time in her career, she had none. The camera swept across the audience. An elderly man pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his face. A young woman sat beside her grandmother, gripping her hand firmly. People weren't just watching, they were feeling. Vanessa shifted in her seat, clearing her throat. "That was quite the speech, Morgan." Morgan offered a small smile. "That wasn't a speech, Vanessa. It was the truth." A deep breath. Then Vanessa smirked. "Let's change the subject, shall we?" She glanced at her cue card. "Your childhood," she said. "Your mother was a cleaner. Your father left when you were just a boy. Tell me, Morgan, do you ever resent having to fight so much harder than most?" The audience tensed. It was a harsh question. But Morgan just smiled, because he knew what was coming next. And when he finally spoke, the world would remember it forever. Vanessa's words lingered in the air like a blade. "Your father left when you were a boy. Do you ever resent that?" The room went still. Morgan Freeman remained motionless, his eyes deep, reflective. 86 years of wisdom rested in his silence. Vanessa smirked, certain she had finally backed him into a corner. But Morgan, he just smiled. Then, in that legendary voice, he spoke. "Yes, my father left, and my mother worked as a cleaner. But do I resent it? No, Vanessa, I thank them." The audience leaned in. Morgan's voice was calm, yet filled with undeniable strength. "My father taught me something important. He showed me exactly the kind of man I didn't want to become. And my mother. He paused, emotion glistening in his eyes. She taught me how to survive. A quiet sob broke the silence from some in the audience. Vanessa blinked. This was not the response she had expected. Morgan leaned in, locking eyes with her. You see, Vanessa, pain is a teacher, and it taught me well. The room was hushed because, once again, Morgan Freeman had transformed pain into wisdom. A faint sniffle echoed, then another. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably. The energy in the room had changed. Morgan Freeman, a man who had endured pain, faced loss, and defied the impossible, sat across from her, not as a victim, but as a conqueror. You asked if I regret my past, he said softly. The truth is, I carry it with me every single day, but never as a burden. He paused, his deep voice resonating through the room. I carry it as a reminder that I'm still here. In the front row, an elderly man lowered his head, his shoulders trembling. A woman whispered, My God, that was beautiful. Morgan sighed, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. The problem with the world today, Vanessa, is that too many people look at their past and feel bitterness. But when I look at mine, I feel gratitude. The audience erupted in applause. Some openly wept. Vanessa bit her lip, realizing she was losing control of the interview. She hadn't expected this. She certainly wasn't prepared for what Morgan was about to say next. Vanessa exhaled sharply. She was slipping. Her plan had been to make Morgan Freeman uncomfortable, to break him down. Instead, she was the one feeling unsteady. She straightened her shoulders, trying to regain composure. Morgan, she said, forcing confidence into her voice. Don't you ever feel afraid? I mean, you're 86 years old. You've had an incredible career, but time doesn't stop for anyone. A harsh question. Morgan just smiled. Then he leaned in, and what he said next shook the world. Vanessa, he murmured, do you know the difference between fear and faith? The audience fell silent. Vanessa blinked. What? Morgan's voice was warm, steady. Fear, he said, is believing in the worst that could happen. Faith is believing in the best. A tear slid down a woman's cheek. Something was happening. Morgan continued. Every morning I wake up, and I choose faith. Vanessa swallowed hard. The power of his words was undeniable, and for the first time in her career, she had nothing left to say. For the first time ever, Vanessa Clark was speechless. Morgan Freeman had just spoken a truth so profound, it pierced the soul. Fear is believing in the worst that could happen. Faith is believing in the best. The audience was shaken. Some covered their mouths, struggling to hold back emotions. Others wept openly. Vanessa glanced around, clearly unsettled. She had expected to control the conversation. She had planned to put him on the defensive, but instead, he had shifted the entire interview into something far greater than himself. The camera focused on an elderly woman in the front row. Tears streamed down her face. Morgan noticed her. He offered a warm smile. You understand, don't you? He asked gently. The woman nodded, her hands trembling as she whispered, Yes. Morgan turned back to Vanessa. You see, Vanessa, wisdom isn't about age. It's about perspective. And the moment you stop fearing the end and start embracing life, that's when you truly start living. The room erupted. Applause mixed with tears. And Vanessa, for the first time, feared what would come next. She shifted in her seat. She was losing control, and she knew it. Her producers were watching from the control room, likely wondering why she hadn't cut him off yet. But she had no choice. This moment belonged to Morgan Freeman. Desperate to regain control, She forced a laugh. "All right, Morgan," she said. "Enough wisdom. Let's talk legacy. What do you think people will remember about you when you're gone?" The room fell silent once more. It was a cold, direct question. But Morgan, he simply chuckled. "Ah, Vanessa," he said, shaking his head. "You're asking the wrong question." Vanessa frowned. "What do you mean?" Morgan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "This isn't about what people will remember about me when I'm gone," he said. "The real question is, what will they remember about you?" Vanessa froze. The audience gasped in unison. This was no longer just an interview. This was a reckoning. And for the first time in her life, Vanessa Clark felt small. She locked eyes with him. The cameras, the bright lights, the audience, they all disappeared. Morgan's words hit like a freight train. "What will they remember about you?" Vanessa had always been the one asking the hard-hitting questions, the ones that made others squirm. But now, the tables had turned. She parted her lips, but no sound came out. Morgan leaned back, giving her room. His gaze was both gentle and unyielding. "You see, Vanessa," he said softly, "I've spent my life telling stories, helping people feel, helping them understand. And when my time is up, I know I'll leave something meaningful behind." The room was completely still. Then, he turned it back on her. "But you," he paused, "you have a powerful platform, yet you use it to tear others down." A muffled sob echoed from the audience. Vanessa glanced down, gripping her cue cards like a lifeline. Morgan exhaled, his voice softer now. "But it's not too late," he said. You can still choose a different path." A single tear slid down Vanessa's face, and in that instant, the world watched her shatter. She sat frozen, fingers trembling. For the first time in her career, she was completely exposed. Morgan Freeman's words hadn't just landed. They had cut straight to her core. "The real question isn't what people will remember about me. The real question is, what will they remember about you?" The silence in the studio was deafening, but inside Vanessa's mind, it was chaos. She had built an empire on dismantling others, on asking the questions no one else dared to. And yet, in this moment, she had no answer. A tear escaped down her cheek. Morgan noticed. He sighed, then spoke again, his voice deep, calm, unwavering. "You see, Vanessa, people think power comes from how loud they can speak, but true power, real strength, comes from knowing when to listen." Somewhere in the audience, a woman sobbed openly. Vanessa lowered her gaze, her breath unsteady. For the first time, she was being made to truly listen, and it was tearing her apart. The audience sat in stunned silence. This wasn't the Vanessa Clark they knew. She was always in charge, always the one steering the conversation. But now she appeared small, exposed, human. A single tear splashed onto her cue card. Morgan's expression softened. "Vanessa," he said gently, "you've spent years sitting across from people, asking them the tough questions. But have you ever turned those questions on yourself?" She inhaled sharply, fighting back the tears. For years, she had uncovered others' truths. Now, hers was being laid bare. She whispered, her voice trembling, I don't know if I like what they'll remember about me." Morgan leaned in, his voice warm and steady, like a father speaking to his child. "Then, my dear," he said softly, "change the story." A sharp inhale rippled through the audience. A single clap, then another. Tears streamed down Vanessa's face. But this time, they weren't from defeat. They were from awakening. And in that moment, the world witnessed something unforgettable. Vanessa Clark sat still, tears glistening, hands trembling, mind racing. The world had just watched her transformation. Morgan Freeman hadn't humiliated her. He hadn't condemned her. He had saved her. She inhaled deeply. For the first time in her career, the question she was about to ask wasn't rooted in pride. It came from a place of sincerity. In a hushed voice, she spoke. Vanessa took a shaky breath. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, was now soft, uncertain. "Morgan," she whispered, "if you had just one message to share with the world before you left this earth, what would it be?" The audience stilled. Morgan closed his eyes for a brief moment, then looked upward, as if searching for an answer written in the stars. Finally, he smiled. "My dear," he said, his voice rich and steady, "life isn't measured by the years we live, but by the love we give." A sharp, broken sob cut through the silence. Vanessa closed her eyes, letting the weight of his words settle deep into her bones. This wasn't just wisdom. It was truth. The kind that didn't just land. It lingered. For a moment, time stood still. Then, one clap, then another, and suddenly, the entire room erupted. Tears streamed down faces. Some wept openly. Others sat motionless, hands pressed over their hearts. Even the camera crew wiped their eyes, trying and failing to remain professional. Vanessa placed a trembling hand over her chest. "Morgan," she whispered, her voice cracking, "you've just changed my life." Morgan chuckled, low and warm. "No, my dear," he said softly. "You changed it yourself." The applause swelled. The air shifted. This was no longer an interview. This was history. The entire audience rose to their feet. Morgan turned to them, his eyes shining. "My friends," he said, voice thick with emotion, "I have lived many years. I have known pain. I have known loss. But I have also witnessed something far stronger than all of that." He looked at them, not as an actor, not as a legend, but as a man who had seen life in its purest form. "I have seen love." A ripple of emotion spread through the room. Morgan smiled. "So if you take anything from tonight, let it be this. Go home. Call someone you love. Forgive someone you've held resentment toward. Tell the people who matter that they matter." A woman in the front row broke down, shoulders shaking. Vanessa pressed a hand to her mouth, her breath uneven. Morgan turned to her one last time. "You asked me what my legacy would be," he murmured. "You're looking at it." And with that, he stepped off the stage, leaving behind a world forever changed.